Imagine Paris in the 17th century, before the sweeping changes of electricity, gaslight, or even widespread literacy had altered its daily rhythm. The city, despite being a center of culture and politics, was still overwhelmingly dark. Once the sun set, sunset was not simply a marker of time. It was the boundary between what could and could not be done. Once the lamps sputtered out in the narrow streets and household fires grew low, you would find yourself in a world dominated by shadows. In that world, a candle was not a mere decoration. It was survival. Candles determined when you could read a prayer book, when merchants could tally their accounts, and when families could continue conversation after supper. But Paris had a problem more, perhaps, depending on who you asked, a solution. The city, perpetually hungry for revenue, had decided that such a simple necessity was a convenient source of income. Thus emerged the tax on candles, a levy that seems almost absurd to modern ears, but once dictated the pace of life in the French capital. The origins of the tax were as dull as any bureaucratic measure. Throughout the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period, rulers were constantly searching for steady streams of income. Wars had to be funded, palaces maintained, and officials paid. Land taxes and trade duties existed, but they were uneven and often resisted. Candles, however, were different. Everyone needed them, rich and poor alike. By imposing a duty on their sale, authorities guaranteed a reliable revenue stream that trickled into the coffers of both the crown and the municipal treasury of Paris. To understand the atmosphere of this tax, you must picture the way candles themselves were made and sold. The most common type, used by ordinary people, was the tallow candle, made from rendered animal fat. These were cheap, smoky, and foul-smelling. They sputtered, smoked, and left greasy residue. But they were affordable, and for most Parisians, they were the only option. At the other end of the spectrum were beeswax candles, golden and sweet-scented, which burned with a steady flame. These were reserved for churches, noble households, and wealthy merchants. When you entered the grand interior of Notre Dame, the glow of beeswax signaled both wealth and holiness. But even these lofty flames were subject to taxation. The regulation of candles became a matter of constant oversight. In Paris, specialized guilds controlled their manufacture. The chandlers or candlemakers were bound by strict rules regarding the purity of the wax, the dimensions of the wicks, and even the weight of the finished product. Taxes were calculated not only on the finished candle, but also on the raw materials, particularly wax. Officials would inspect shipments arriving at the city gates, weighing sacks of wax and calculating the levy before the goods could even reach the chandlers' workshops. This created a peculiar atmosphere in the city markets. Imagine yourself walking through the bustling stalls near Les Halles, where food, household goods, and tools were exchanged daily. Among the fishmongers and bread sellers, candle merchants would stand with carefully arranged stacks of tallow cylinders or bundles of wax tapers. Each sale carried with it the invisible presence of taxation. Buyers grumbled, chandlers schemed, and officials kept their ledgers. A candle was no longer just lighted, was an instrument of fiscal policy. For ordinary Parisians, this meant that night was rationed. A poor household might carefully count its candles, deciding whether to use them for evening meals or save them for important occasions. A family might allow themselves only one stub of tallow each night, letting the flame gutter out soon after supper, plunging the room into darkness while conversation dwindled. For artisans, this was more than inconvenience. Many crafts, tailoring, shoemaking, even simple bookkeeping, required precise vision. Without adequate light, work slowed and incomes suffered. To pay both for the candle and its tax was a daily calculation, and yet, for the authorities, this was ordinary business. Just as salt, wine, and flour were subject to levies, so too was light itself. Irony. It meant that every flicker of light was, in a sense, sponsored by the state. The very act of pushing back the darkness became a transaction with government. The candle tax also reveals something about Parisian society itself. The divide between rich and poor became visible after sunset. In the homes of the wealthy, wax tapers burned in silver holders, throwing a golden glow across polished wood and embroidered tapestries. Servants moved about with handheld candles, illuminating staircases and warming chambers. In contrast, the majority of the population relied on a dim tallow stub, its smoke staining the low ceiling, its faint flame casting long shadows. The tax did not erase this divide. If anything, it deepened it, ensuring that light remained yet another marker of privilege. Still, candles were not simply tools. Weddings, funerals, and religious ceremonies all relied on candlelight. Baptisms were performed with a small taper, funerals with solemn rows of flames, masses with entire chandeliers of beeswax. In these moments, the tax was not merely a matter of household budgeting, but of communal identity. The crown, by taxing candles, inserted itself into the very rituals that marked birth, death, and faith. It was not only households and churches that suffered under this levy. The candle tax became a fertile ground for disputes and evasions. Smuggling wax into Paris became a minor but persistent trade, with merchants slipping small bundles past the gates to avoid the levy. Inspectors, in turn, became ever more vigilant. Records from the 17th century describe tedious lawsuits between chandlers and tax collectors, with accusations of short-weight candles or mismeasured wax. These disputes filled pages of legal parchment, producing a paper trail of boredom that still survives in archives today. The broader effect of this tax was subtle but far-reaching. In an age when candles determined the length of the workday, the cost of light helped define productivity. The poor, unable to afford many candles, lived by daylight. Their lives contracted in winter, when the sun set early, and they retreated to bed soon after nightfall. Wealthier households, illuminated by wax, stretched their hours deep into the evening, enjoying reading, correspondence, or music long after darkness had fallen. Thus, the candle tax indirectly shaped the rhythm of society, reinforcing class distinctions in the very fabric of daily time. And yet, as mundane as it may seem, the candle tax also hints at something larger: the fragility of early modern economies. States did not possess the vast, complex systems of taxation that modern governments employ. They relied on such small levies on salt, candles, and wine to keep themselves afloat. The monarchy, glittering in Versailles, rested on 1,000 such tiny burdens, each one falling on the shoulders of ordinary people in their daily routines. But if candles were taxed, what did this mean for the future of light in Paris? How long could such a system last before innovation swept it away? The candle tax carried with it an implicit question, one that hovered over the flickering streets. What would happen when a new source of light arrived, one that could not be so easily measured, weighed, or taxed? Like most taxes in the early modern world, it took on a life of its own, intertwining itself with the habits of households, the strategies of merchants, and the vigilance of state officials. If Section 1 painted the broad outlines of how the tax shaped daily life, Section 2 must linger over the quieter details, the evasions, the adjustments, and the subtle ways Parisians bent their lives around this small but persistent levy. To begin with, evasion was inevitable. No matter how meticulous the inspectors at the city gates, Paris was a sprawling city with countless entry points, narrow lanes, riverside landings, and unguarded paths. Wax, being compact and easily disguised, was a natural candidate for smuggling. Farmers bringing poultry or vegetables into the city might conceal small bundles beneath their carts. Merchants might declare one weight at inspection and deliver another once inside. Over time, entire minor trades sprang up around this quiet defiance. If you had the right contacts, you could purchase candles untaxed, their price slightly lower, their origin ambiguous. Of course, the authorities were not unaware. The archives record the dull but steady drumbeat of prosecutions, chandlers accused of underreporting production, merchants fined for bypassing gate inspections, even parish priests caught purchasing wax outside official channels to save church funds. The cases rarely made headlines, if anything. Light, for all its softness, became a contested commodity in the home. Adaptation took a different form. Poorer families, already limited in their candle use, found ways to stretch their supply. In some cases, families pooled resources, neighbors gathering together in a single room, sharing one candle, rather than each household wasting its own. Some historians have noted that this culture of thrift contributed to the well-known early to bed, early to rise rhythm. To us, it might sound healthy or quaint. To them, it was necessity, shaped in part by taxation. Artisans and workers faced a different problem. Yet, candles were costly. Some tried to switch tasks performing coarse cutting or rough shaping in dim light, saving fine stitching. For daylight hours, others worked communally, several artisans sharing the same candle, moving their benches close together so that one flame served many pairs of eyes. In guild records, disputes sometimes arose about how the cost of candles should be divided among apprentices and masters. In noble households, candlelight became a symbol not only of comfort but of status. Banquets glittered with hundreds of wax tapers, illuminating gilded plate and rich fabrics. Such displays were deliberate. A noble host might burn more candles than strictly necessary, signaling wealth through extravagance. This, too, was entangled with the tax by displaying light. One also displayed the ability to afford taxation without complaint. Visitors to such gatherings were meant to be impressed not only by the brightness, but by the financial nonchalance it represented. In churches, the issue was even more pronounced. Religious rituals demanded abundance. Here, the candle tax was more than a household burden. It was an institutional strain. Parishes, often strapped for funds, had to account for the cost of light in their annual budgets. Some raised additional alms specifically for wax, framing it as a pious contribution. The irony, of course, was that devotion to God passed through the filter of fiscal administration. To keep candles burning for the saints, one first had to satisfy the tax collector. At the municipal level, the candle tax served as a steady but unspectacular source of revenue. These figures were often compared with previous years, noted in tidy columns, and used to forecast future income. For modern historians, these records are invaluable, revealing not only how much light was consumed in Paris, but also how economic fluctuations, bad harvests, war disruptions, or population growth affected the city. Entire careers were spent in the slow accumulation of such entries. Men who measured their lives in candles taxed rather than candles burned. The candle tax also illustrates a broader truth about early modern governance, that the state was most present not in moments of high drama, but in the small, routine interactions of daily life. A soldier might never see battle, a peasant might never meet a king, but everyone who lit a candle felt, indirectly, the hand of authority. A system in which wars and governments were funded not by grand gestures, but by the steady siphoning of resources from ordinary activities. In this sense, every Parisian who bought a candle contributed, in some minute way, to the grandeur of Versailles, the wages of soldiers, or the upkeep of roads. Unlike taxes on land, which fell on specific classes, or duties on luxury goods, which affected only the wealthy, this was universal. Everyone needed light. Thus, the burden was felt broadly. If unequally, the poor grumbled at the unfairness, though rarely in open revolt. Their discontent seeped into songs, jokes, and muttered complaints. The kind of low-level resistance that rarely makes headlines but shapes popular sentiment. It blowing out a candle stub and muttering that even the darkness had been taxed. Adaptation, however, is never static. As the 17th gave way to the 18th century, new lighting technologies began to emerge. Oil lamps, though still expensive, offered an alternative. In some neighborhoods, wealthier households experimented. These, too, were subject to taxation, but their novelty complicated enforcement. Municipal officials debated whether oil should be taxed like wax, whether lamps counted as candles in the legal sense, and how to classify imports of foreign oils. In such debates, one sees the slow encroachment of innovation upon old systems. And then there was the matter of street lighting. Paris, often touted as one of Europe's great capitals, began to experiment with public lamps. These were not candles, but oil lamps, burning under glass to protect against the wind. For Parisians, the effect was transformative. Streets that had once been treacherous in darkness now glowed faintly at night. Yet the candle tax persisted, even as its dominance in private life began to wane. The irony was not lost on citizens. The city taxed their candles, even as it illuminated the streets with oil. The answer lies in the inertia of bureaucracy. Once established, a tax creates structures, inspectors' offices, records that take on a life of their own. To abolish the tax would mean dismantling not only a revenue stream, but an entire administrative apparatus. Thus, even as oil lamps spread, the candle tax remained, clinging to relevance, feeding the ledgers of clerks who had built their careers on its enforcement. By the 18th century, then, Paris found itself in a curious position. The candle tax was still collected, households still rationed light, and smuggling still occurred. But the cultural landscape was shifting. Pamphlets and essays occasionally criticized the proliferation of small taxes, lumping the candle levy among many irritations that sapped the energy of common people. While the candle tax was not, in itself, enough to ignite revolt, it became part of a larger pattern, the sense that the monarchy fed on the lifeblood of ordinary life, taxing not only bread and salt, but even the hours of night. Here lies the quiet significance of such a mundane measure. It was not dramatic, not catastrophic, but steady. It taught Parisians to measure their evenings, to count their stubs of tallow, to weigh not only wax, but also the cost of light itself. It contributed, drop by drop, to the reservoir of frustration that would one day swell into revolution. And yet, in the dim glow of a taxed candle, the question lingered: what would come after? Could a society built on taxing every necessity truly withstand the winds of change? Or was the candle tax merely a flickering light in the long twilight of the ancien regime? By the late 18th century, Paris was changing in ways that would have seemed unimaginable to the chandlers and inspectors of a century before. The candle tax, once a pillar of municipal revenue, was still in place, but it existed in a city whose rhythms were beginning to stretch beyond the flicker of tallow flames. What had started as a simple levy on wax and fat had become, in its persistence, a symbol of something larger, the weight of the state on the most ordinary acts of life. To light a candle was to enter into a financial agreement with authority. But by now, the relationship between Parisians and their rulers was beginning to fray. The 18th century brought both innovation and discontent. On the one hand, alternatives to the candle multiplied. Improved oil lamps spread not only in the streets, but into private homes. The Agend lamp, invented in the 1780s, revolutionized illumination by providing a steady, bright flame that consumed oil more efficiently. For the first time, households had access to light that rivaled wax in brightness without requiring the same expense. Intellectuals of the Enlightenment embraced these lamps, their writings spilling across pages made legible by oil rather than tallow. Philosophers who criticized the arbitrary burdens of taxation often did so under the glow of these new devices, their very light carrying symbolic weight against the old system. And yet, the candle tax lingered, stubborn as ever. Bureaucracy does not yield easily. Inspectors still weighed shipments at the gates, chandlers still recorded their transactions, and households still counted their candle stubs. The records of the candle tax from this era reflect both continuity and decline. Revenue remained steady, but no longer grew in proportion to the population. Simply put, Parisians were beginning to find other ways to light their nights. At the same time, resentment against taxes of all kinds was mounting. It was not just candles, of course. Bread, wine, and salt were all subject to levies that seemed to press hardest on the poor. The hated gabelle, the tax on salt, is often remembered as one of the sparks of revolutionary anger. But in conversations, complaints, and pamphlets, the candle tax also appeared. To tax light itself seemed to many a perfect metaphor for the monarchy's reach-in intrusion into the most intimate and necessary aspects of daily life. It is here that the story of the candle tax takes on broader historical meaning. For centuries, it had been tolerated, even if grumbled about, because it seemed natural that rulers would take a share of basic goods. But the Enlightenment introduced a new language, rights, reason, and the social contract. Philosophers argued that government existed to protect, not exploit. In this new framework, a tax on light no longer seemed ordinary. It seemed absurd, a petty symbol of tyranny. If even the flame of a candle was not free, what else might be controlled? The Revolution of 1789 did not erupt over candles, but it swept away the world in which such taxes could persist unquestioned. The National Assembly, in its flurry of decrees, abolished a host of levies that had burdened everyday life. The candle tax, along with many others, was eliminated in the great restructuring of fiscal order. In the revolutionary press, its abolition was sometimes noted with satisfaction, as though one more shackle had been cast off. Light, at last, was free at least in principle. But history rarely resolves itself so neatly. Even after the formal end of the candle tax, the practical problem of financing the state remained. The revolution needed money just as much as the monarchy had. New systems of taxation were introduced, some more equitable, others just as resented. The burden of funding wars, administration, and infrastructure did not disappear. What changed was the language around it. Taxes were now framed as contributions of citizens rather than exactions of subjects. Yet for many Parisians struggling to afford light in their homes, the change felt less dramatic. Candles were still expensive, lamps still consumed costly oil, and the struggle to stretch the night remained. In the 19th century, however, a true transformation arrived: gaslight. Beginning in the 1820s and 1830s, gas lamps spread through Paris, replacing oil lanterns in the streets, and, eventually, entering wealthier homes. For the first time, darkness itself could be banished with the turn of a tap, the steady hiss of gas producing a flame that burned longer and brighter than any candle. The city that had once rationed light by taxed stubs of tallow became, in the eyes of visitors, the City of Light. It is a title that seems ironic when one recalls the centuries when Parisian evenings were dim, smoky, and carefully measured. Out under the burden of taxation, the candle tax, in retrospect, can seem almost laughable. Why tax such a simple object, something so basic to survival? But in the context of early modern governance, it made perfect sense. Candles were universal, measurable, and unavoidable. They provided the kind of steady revenue that states desperately needed. And therein lies the lesson. Great systems often rest on small details. The Palace of Versailles, the armies of France, the bureaucrats of Parasol were, in some sense, funded by flickering flames. For the historian, the candle tax offers a window into the intersection of daily life and political power. It shows how authority reached not only into land and trade, but into the kitchen, the workshop, and the parish. It reminds us that history is not only the story of kings and battles, but of small objects, taxed and counted, that shaped how people lived their nights. A Parisian family, sitting in darkness after extinguishing their single candle to save money, was participating in the same system that gilded the halls of Versailles. The gap between the two was lit, faintly, by taxed flames. It also teaches us something about resilience. People adapted, as they always do. They pooled candles, they shared light, they smuggled wax, they adjusted their work hours. They found ways to live within the boundaries set by taxation. And when those boundaries broke in revolution, they embraced new systems, new technologies, and new rhythms. In this sense, the candle tax is not only a story of oppression, but of endurance, and perhaps the most thought-provoking reflection of all is this: the candle tax was not unique. Throughout history, states have found ways to tax the necessities of life. Salt, windows, fireplaces, even shadows in certain Italian cities, all have been levied at one time or another. The story of the candle tax is but one chapter in the broader history of how governments fund themselves by reaching into the ordinary lives of their people. Today, when we flip a switch and flood a room with light, we rarely think of taxation. Yet electricity, too, carries its costs, its fees, its share taken by the state. The mechanisms have changed, but the principle remains. So when we look back at Paris in the 17th and 18th centuries, when candles flickered under the watchful eye of inspectors, we are not simply observing a quaint or archaic practice. We are seeing the foundations of modern governance, the endless search for revenue, the delicate balance between necessity and burden, the ways in which small acts accumulate into the weight of a system. The candle tax may be forgotten in most histories of France, overshadowed by wars, revolutions, and the drama of kings. But in its quiet persistence, it reveals the true texture of life. It shows us a city where light was never free, where evenings were measured out in taxed flames, and where the struggle between necessity and authority burned just as steadily as the tallow candles in a Parisian kitchen. And so we close this story with one last flickering thought. If even the darkness of Paris could be taxed, what other necessities of life have, in different times and places, been quietly transformed into revenue? And more importantly, how many of the things we take for granted today will one day seem as strange, as absurd, and as quietly burdensome as the tax on candles? If the candle tax of Paris teaches us how governments reached into the daily lives of their subjects, then the Byzantine Empire shows us what happens when paperwork itself becomes the heart of governance. To enter the world of a Byzantine clerk is to step into a landscape not of battles or coronations, but of endless parchment scrolls, wax tablets, and ledgers filled with carefully drawn numbers and names. It is a world where ink, rather than the sword, sustained an empire that lasted for more than 1,000 years. And for those who lived inside that world, the daily rhythm was not one of glory, but of bureaucracy. The Byzantine Empire, born from the eastern half of Rome, inherited more than soldiers and laws. It inherited the Roman obsession with records. From the earliest days in Constantinople, emperors relied on an elaborate bureaucracy to manage taxes, land, armies, and trade. The empire's survival depended less on the brilliance of generals than on the accuracy of clerks, who ensured that soldiers were paid, that tax revenues reached the treasury, and that grain supplies were counted. Without the clerk, the empire's machinery would grind to a halt. He is not famous, nor does history record his name. He sits in a dimly lit chamber within the great palace complex, not far from the hippodrome. Before him lies a wax tablet, smoothed flat by heat, waiting to receive the sharp marks of a stylus. He dips a pen in ink for parchment entries, counting coins, weighing grain, or recording the obligations of a distant village. His life is one of repetition, the same motions, day after day. The accounts themselves were tedious but vital. Land taxes formed the empire's backbone, assessed on peasants who farmed fields from Anatolia to the Balkans. To submit detailed declarations, how much land was under cultivation, how many oxen worked the fields, how many vines or olive trees bore fruit. Clerks received these figures, tallied them against expected yields, and calculated what was owed. It was not glamorous work, but it was the kind of labor that allowed Constantinople's walls to be repaired, soldiers to be provisioned, and ships to be built. The detail could be staggering. Surviving Byzantine manuals of administration, such as the Book of the Eparch, reveal how meticulous the system could be. Chandlers, bakers, butchers, and money changers were all regulated by pages of rules, each one requiring records and oversight. Clerks had to ensure not only that taxes were collected, but that trade guilds followed regulations, weights and measures were correct, and monopolies remained in the emperor's hands. Decrees and countersignatures. A Byzantine office was less a place of grand decisions than of endless paper trails. For the clerks themselves, life could be suffocatingly routine. They arrived each morning, unrolled scrolls, sharpened pens, and sat before wooden desks. They copied figures, wrote memoranda, and corrected errors. Errors were dangerous. A miscounted shipment of grain or a miswritten tax total could have consequences. An underpaid soldier might desert. An unpaid contractor might halt a building. A clerk's mistake could echo far beyond the office walls. Thus, precision became not only a habit, but a survival strategy. Many clerks lived in quiet anxiety, aware that their careers depended on accuracy. And yet, this dull world of ink and parchment was one of quiet power. To control the records was to control reality. If a village's tax obligation was written down as higher than it could bear, that village might be ruined. If it was written as lower, the treasury lost revenue. Clerks had the ability, through their pens, to shape the fortunes of communities. It is little wonder that corruption often seeped in. Bribes could persuade a clerk to underreport a harvest, to overlook missing livestock, or to lose an inconvenient petition. These acts were not dramatic crimes, but subtle adjustments in the ledgers, invisible to most but significant to those affected. The archives of Byzantium, fragmentary though they are, give glimpses of this life. A requisition order for shipbuilding timber, a receipt for tax payments in kind, a record of grain distributions all reveal the hand of clerks. For the most part, these men remain anonymous, their handwriting the only trace of their existence. They were not remembered for speeches or victories, but for the slow accumulation of lines of text. To read their work is to feel the weight of routine pressing across centuries. For the ordinary Byzantine subject, the clerk was the face of authority. The emperor in Constantinople was distant. The soldiers passed through only in times of war. But the clerk was present every year, demanding figures, receipts, or payments. To pay one's taxes meant facing the clerk, presenting goods, coins, or livestock, and receiving a stamped acknowledgement in return. Authority was not the face of majesty, but the scratching of a pen across parchment. One might imagine the fatigue of these men, eyes straining by lamplight, backs bent over desks, fingers cramped from hours of writing. Complaints of this kind survive in scattered anecdotes, clerks lamenting the endlessness of their tasks, the cold of their offices in winter, or the monotony of copying yet another list of names. It was not heroic, but it was the glue that held the empire together. When later historians marvel at Byzantium's longevity, surviving invasions, their accounts were not confined to money. The Byzantine state managed people as well as goods. Census lists recorded households, occupations, and obligations. Military registers tracked which families owed military service, which could send sons, which could provide horses. Marriage records, inheritance disputes, and land transfers all passed through clerical hands. To live in Byzantium was to be inscribed in its paperwork, your existence noted, classified, and preserved in ink. And this bureaucracy had its rhythms. Each year brought cycles of assessment, collection, and redistribution. Each cycle brought paperwork. Grain from Egypt was tallied, shipped, and recorded. Silk from the imperial workshops was counted, inspected, and entered into ledgers. Even donations to the church were noted, for the boundary between sacred and secular wealth was porous. For clerks, time was measured not in seasons, but in accounts closed, scrolls completed, archives filled. If the soldier's life was measured in battles, and the monk's life in prayers, the clerk's life was measured in columns of numbers and lines of ink. It was a life that few celebrated, but without it, the empire could not have functioned. And so we are left with a question. What does it mean when the survival of an empire depends less on generals or emperors than on the anonymous men who counted coins in dim offices? History as the clash of armies outside the walls of Constantinople. The Byzantine bureaucracy did not consist of a single clerk alone, but of entire layers of clerical offices arranged like a finely woven net. Senior administrators, men who bore titles such as logotheta, word that meant one who accounts for words. There was the logothete of the drome, who oversaw the imperial postal service and intelligence network. The logothete of the genicon managed general taxation and the treasury. These officials were not themselves bent over scrolls every day, but they directed armies of subordinates who were, beneath them, in dusty offices, sat the ordinary scribes, each of whom had their narrow sphere, recording payments, tallying livestock, or copying decrees. The life of a mid-level clerk might sound uniform. A clerk in the military finance bureau, for instance. He would then cross-check those numbers against previous years, adjusting for changes in strength, deaths, or new recruits. In contrast, a clerk in the Bureau of Trade Regulation might spend his days inspecting scales in Constantinople's markets, or recording inventories of silks imported from the East. Every corner of Byzantine life, from the feeding of soldiers to the price of bread, generated its own small mountain of paper. The clerks worked with tools that were humble but essential, could be smoothed away with heat and rewritten. Once figures were confirmed, they were transferred to parchment or papyrus for permanence. Seals of wax or lead were applied to official documents to certify their authority, each seal bearing the imprint of an office or an individual. Wax, pens whispering across parchment, and the faint crack of seals being pressed and broken. But as orderly as this sounds, the reality was less serene. The Byzantine bureaucracy was famous for its rivalries, by accuracy, but by alliances. A misplaced document could be interpreted as negligence or sabotage. To survive in this environment required more than neat handwriting. It demanded caution, discretion, and an ability to read the moods of superiors. For all their reputation as faceless bureaucrats, Byzantine clerks navigated a political landscape as delicate as that of courtiers. Consider the matter of promotion. A young scribe, entering service perhaps through a family connection, might spend years copying mundane records. Advancement required the favor of a superior, but favors could be bought or earned in subtle ways. But equally, an ill-chosen word, a poorly phrased petition, or a careless mistake might consign one to decades of obscurity. Their pens influenced the empire's wealth and policies. It is tempting to imagine these clerks as buried in figures, but their work also required human interaction. A merchant might seek a license to ship goods. A widow might need confirmation of her inheritance. Each case required the clerk to record details, cross-check archives, and draft responses. The interaction was rarely warm. Byzantine clerks had a reputation, even in their own time, for cold formality, speaking in formulas, and demanding endless documents before anything could proceed. To the common people, the empire sometimes appeared less as a ruler in Constantinople than as a line of clerks who stamped and countersigned their petitions. The empire trusted them with its very survival. Soldiers on distant frontiers were paid only because a clerk ensured the coins reached them. Bridges were repaired, monasteries endowed, palaces decorated dull, because anonymous scribes wrote the right words in the right columns. The grandeur of emperors relied on the drudgery of penmanship. Byzantine writers themselves often mocked the bureaucracy. They described it as overgrown, slow-moving, and corrupt. Satirical poems survive that. Ridicule clerks for their endless lists and their obsession with detail. Yet these criticisms were usually penned by elites who found the process frustrating, not by those who had to maintain the empire's balance sheets. From the inside, the bureaucracy felt less like a parody and more like a burden of responsibility that never lightened. There were always more figures to copy, more petitions to process, more decrees to record. Archives themselves became a kind of monument to this labor. Shelves groaned under the weight of scrolls and codices, some decades old, others centuries. Fires, floods, and invasions periodically destroyed records. But the empire rebuilt them each time, as though the act of recording was as important as the information itself. A payment unrecorded was no payment at all. A decree unsigned might as well never have been issued. Bureaucracy was not simply a tool of governance. It was a philosophy, a belief that the written word could shape reality. The physical setting of a clerk's day reinforced this. The air smelled of ink and wax, sometimes of mildew from damp parchment. In winter, they were cold and dim. Candles or oil lamps provided light, though too much smoke risked damaging documents. Clerks often squinted, their eyes strained from the gloom, and yet day after day they reported for duty, bent over their tasks. One might imagine them dreaming, at times, of lives elsewhere, on a farm, in the marketplace, perhaps even in the army. But the world of bureaucracy had its own strange magnetism. More than that, it offered the comfort of routine. Still, the question remains, what did these clerks make of their place in history? The next seal to be pressed. Perhaps they felt both at once, pride in the importance of their work and weariness at its endlessness. Each finished ledger was the beginning of another. It was, in many ways, the most boring story imaginably, and yet it was the story on which an empire rested. When the Byzantine Empire is remembered today, it is often for its glittering mosaics, its domed churches, or its turbulent emperors who rose and fell amid palace intrigue. Yet behind these vivid images was a quieter reality, one that endured longer than any dynasty, the bureaucracy. For nearly 1,000 years, clerks and scribes gave continuity to the empire. Emperors were overthrown, provinces lost, religions debated. But the ledgers kept being filled, the petitions processed, the decrees copied. This persistence became one of Byzantium's most remarkable legacies, not in spectacle, but in endurance. To understand this legacy, one must look at what came after Byzantium. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, the Ottoman conquerors did not discard the Byzantine system. On the contrary, they adapted it. The Ottomans built their own vast bureaucracy with registers of land, taxes, and subjects that resembled those of their predecessors. The Ottomans, like the Byzantines, believed that the empire could only be governed if everything was recorded. The transfer of scribal habits across cultures was not accidental. Many Byzantine clerks themselves were absorbed into the Ottoman administration, their skills too valuable to waste. Thus, the pens that had once served Christian emperors soon served Muslim sultans, carrying forward the habit of documentation without pause. Western Europe, too, inherited something of this Byzantine ethos, though less directly. Medieval kingdoms often admired the Byzantine ability to preserve records and issue precise decrees. Latin travelers to Constantinople marveled at how every aspect of life seemed accounted for, from ships in the harbor to loaves of bread in the markets. They sometimes mocked this obsession with paperwork, yet they envied its stability. Over time, as European states grew stronger, they adopted similar bureaucratic methods: tax ledgers, property records, official seals. The Byzantine idea that governance required writing, and that writing created authorities, into the bloodstream of Europe. Even in the modern world, faint echoes of Byzantine clerks can be felt. Consider the experience of standing in line at a government office today, waiting to present forms, collect signatures, or pay fees. The setting may be fluorescent lit rather than candlelit, and the forms printed on paper rather than parchment. But the logic is the same. Officials still demand proof, seals, and proper filing. The frustration many feel when navigating bureaucracy is, in its way, a continuation of the size of Byzantine petitioners who once shuffled through narrow corridors in Constantinople. The clerk, with his ink-stained fingers, has been replaced by the civil servant with a computer keyboard, yet the principle is identical. The state exists in its documents. What makes this legacy even more striking is how little glory was attached to it. Byzantine clerks were not celebrated in chronicles. Their names are rarely preserved, yet the empire could not function without them. Their anonymity was itself part of the system. The work mattered more than the worker. This humility contrasts with the grandeur of emperors who claimed divine authority. While rulers boasted of victories and visions, clerks measured wheat and tallied coins, and in the long run, the work of the clerks often proved more lasting. Victories faded, dynasties collapsed, but the habit of record-keeping survived. Clerks themselves may have known this, or perhaps not. Their daily lives gave them little time for philosophy. They measured, copied, sealed, and filed. But there is a quiet heroism in such routine. To dedicate decades to paperwork in the service of something larger than oneself requires a kind of endurance that is rarely praised. The Byzantines, for all their sarcasm toward their own officials, built a civilization that relied upon this endurance more than upon any single act of conquest. We might picture one such clerk, late in his career. His hair has thinned, his eyes are dim, and his hands are stiff from years of writing. He sits in a cold office, surrounded by shelves of records he himself helped to compile. Outside, Constantinople bustles with merchants, monks, and soldiers, but inside he copies yet another set of accounts. He knows that when he dies, another will take his place, and the records will continue. He does not expect to be remembered. He does not even sign his name in most documents, and yet, unknowingly, he is shaping the very possibility of empire. This, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson of the Byzantine clerk, that history is not only made by emperors and generals, but also by the anonymous many who maintained the machinery of daily life. Without them, palaces would crumble, armies starve, and decrees vanish. Their work was boring, but it was essential. It is fitting, in a way, that their story is told slowly, in long sentences and quiet descriptions, for that is how their lives passed, steadily, patiently, one record at a time. As we close this story, we can see how the Byzantine bureaucracy was not a mere curiosity of the past, but part of a longer human tendency. We crave order, and we seek to inscribe it on paper. We mistrust memory, preferring the permanence of ink. And so, whether in Constantinople 1,000 years ago, or in our own offices today, the endless accounts continue. The clerks of Byzantium have vanished, but their spirit lingers each time we reach for a form, a file, or a ledger. Their legacy is not in monuments of stone, but in the very idea that civilization is sustained by records, carefully written, endlessly repeated. If you imagine Paris in the Middle Ages, perhaps your mind drifts toward cathedrals, bustling markets, or the flowing Seine. But if you picture the city at night, you must try to see it not as we do now, with electric lamps spilling light into every corner, but as a place that sank into near total darkness once the sun set. Darkness was not just an inconvenience. It was a genuine problem for city officials, for shopkeepers, for travelers, and for families who had to decide whether to burn precious tallow to keep their rooms illuminated or save their resources for another day. In such a setting, light itself became a commodity, and in time it became a taxable one. In the heart of the city, where narrow streets bent and twisted, candles were the simplest and most common source of artificial light. Wealthier households might purchase wax candles, which burned more cleanly and brightly. But the majority of Parisians relied on cheaper tallow candles, made from animal fat. These gave off a smoky flame, an uneven glow, and a strong odor that clung to rooms and clothing. Yet they were indispensable. The day's labor often could not end when the sun disappeared. Bakers needed to prepare dough for the morning markets. Artisans, scribes, and traders all found themselves working into the dusk. Families, too, relied on candlelight for meals, prayers, and the simplest of tasks, such as mending clothing or caring for children. The importance of candles was matched by their cost. They required resources that were not always easy to come by: animal fat, beeswax, or imported oils that made candles not just a household necessity, but also a valuable part of the city's economy. Wherever value could be found, officials eventually discovered a way to regulate it. And so, the city of Paris, facing its own growing administrative needs, devised one of its more peculiar and burdensome levies, a tax on candles. The origins of this tax lie in the city's broader effort to fund communal needs. By the late Middle Ages, Paris was growing larger, denser, and more complex. Streets needed paving, markets needed regulation, bridges required upkeep, and the machinery of governance itself required steady revenue. Unlike modern taxation systems, to spread costs broadly, medieval taxes were often highly specific. Instead of a general income tax, governments imposed duties on salt, on milling grain, on wine transported downriver, or, in this case, on the humble candle. To understand why a candle tax made sense to the authorities, one must consider the nature of medieval city life. Paris was a place of crowded houses, fire-prone timber structures, and frequent disputes over safety. Open flames were everywhere: hearths, lanterns, and candles, each one a potential hazard. By regulating candles, officials argued, they could not only raise money, but also exert a kind of control over how fire and light were used within the city. The tax gave them a way to monitor production and sale, to fix prices, and, in theory at least, to manage the risks that came with open flames. Of course, the practical effect was that the cost of light rose for ordinary Parisians. The wealthy could afford wax, with or without added fees, but for those relying on tallow, every additional coin mattered. In this sense, the candle tax became one of many small but persistent burdens that defined medieval urban life. It was not ruinous in the way that famine, war, or plague could be, but it was an ever-present annoyance, something people could not escape simply by living modestly. After all, everyone needed light. This need was most visible in public spaces. In the centuries before permanent street lighting, Parisian nights were notoriously perilous. Crime thrived in the dark, and even simple navigation could be treacherous. When uneven stones and open gutters lined the streets, in response, city officials experimented with forms of communal illumination. At times, they required residents to hang lanterns outside their homes. At other moments, they taxed candles, not just as household items, but as a way to finance the lighting of certain districts. The idea was simple: the people who used the city's streets should help pay for their lighting. The execution, however, was far from smooth. Records suggest that the candle tax was collected in a variety of ways. Sometimes it appeared as a surcharge on the sale of candles themselves, meaning that every purchase carried an extra cost. At other times, it was levied in connection with broader market duties, folded into the fees that merchants paid to sell their goods. In both forms, it was resented. Taxation on something so basic seemed to highlight the divide between rulers and ruled. between those who set policy and those who had to live with its consequences. One of the more telling aspects of the candle tax was its persistence. Unlike emergency levies that might rise during war and fall during peace, the candle tax lingered. It proved to be a reliable stream of revenue, which meant that city authorities were reluctant to give it up. Once established, such taxes rarely disappeared. Instead, they became woven into the fabric of daily life, invisible in their inevitability, but always felt in their burden. The symbolism of taxing light itself was not lost on those who lived with it. In many cultures, light carried spiritual meaning, representing knowledge, clarity, or divine presence. In Paris, where the great cathedral of Notre Dame stood as both a spiritual and civic landmark, candles were not only practical but also sacred. They burned in chapels, at altars, and during festivals. To tax such an object was to touch both the daily and the sacred, to place a price not just on utility but on meaning. For the average Parisian, though, the candle tax was not a philosophical issue. It was a calculation. How many candles could one afford? How many evenings would be spent in relative darkness? How much light should be reserved for work, and how much for prayer or leisure? These were the kinds of small, practical questions that the tax forced upon families. They shaped the rhythm of daily life in ways that, while easy to overlook, were profoundly real. It is tempting, with the benefit of hindsight, to see the candle tax as quaint or peculiar. After all, who today thinks of paying a fee each time a light is switched on? Yet, for centuries, access to light was never guaranteed. It was always dependent on labor, on resources, and, increasingly, on the willingness of governments to extract their share. The candle tax was just one instance of this broader reality, that even the most ordinary aspects of life could become objects of regulation. As Paris grew and changed, the reliance on candles remained, and so too did the tax. But this raises a question that will guide us forward. How exactly did the city enforce such a levy, and what did it mean for those who sought to avoid it? Was the glow of a candle something that could truly be counted, regulated, and controlled by the hand of bureaucracy? Or was light, by its very nature, too elusive to be contained? When a city introduces a new tax, the idea often seems simple enough. Attach a fee to a useful item, collect the money, and use it to finance public needs. But in practice, such levies were far from straightforward. The candle tax in Paris was no exception. To tax light was to step into the delicate rhythms of daily life. And it required not only rules on paper, but also systems of enforcement. Someone had to determine when and how the tax applied. Someone had to collect it, and someone had to watch for those who tried to avoid it. In this way, the candle tax became less about flames and more about paperwork, ledgers, and human frustration. The most common form of enforcement came at the point of sale. Candlemakers, chandlers, and market vendors were required to add the tax to the price of their wares. This meant that, in effect, every transaction was monitored by proxy. The seller became the collector, passing a portion of each sale onward to the authorities. For city officials, this was efficient. For merchants, however, it was yet another burden. They were now responsible not only for their trade, but also for the accuracy of their records. Misreporting sales, whether by accident or design, could bring fines. For those living on the thin margins of medieval commerce, the extra responsibility was unwelcome. The bureaucratic machinery around this tax grew surprisingly complex. Inspectors might visit workshops to verify the amount of wax or tallow in stock, cross-checking it against recorded sales. Ledger books were sometimes demanded, and receipts had to be issued. These details may sound dry, but they mattered enormously. In practice, a candle could burn away in a matter of hours, leaving nothing behind but a bit of melted fat or wax. Proof of its existence lay only in the records. In this way, the candle tax became a peculiar dance between something fleeting and something fixed, a flame that vanished almost as soon as it appeared, and a bureaucratic entry meant to capture it forever. Unsurprisingly, the system was imperfect. Tax evasion flourished in small, quiet ways. Some chandlers sold candles off the books, slipping coins directly into their own purses rather than into the city's coffers. Others made smaller candles and disguised them as larger ones, or mixed tallow with other substances to stretch supplies. Customers, too, participated in evasion, buying through informal networks of neighbors or friends rather than through official markets. In this way, resistance to the candle tax was not loud or dramatic, but subtle, woven into the fabric of ordinary transactions. Yet, despite these evasions, the tax persisted. Its survival owed less to perfect enforcement and more to the inevitability of demand. People could not do without light. Even if candles were taxed, even if they became more expensive, families continued to buy them. It was precisely this inescapable need that made the tax so reliable. Authorities tolerated a certain level of evasion, knowing that the majority of households had no choice but to purchase at least some candles through official channels. Complaints, however, were frequent. In the records of city petitions and correspondence, one occasionally finds traces of frustration with the burden of light. Bakers, in particular, grumbled that their trade demanded long hours after dark, forcing them to burn more candles than most. Artisans, too, noted that their work often required precision at night, whether carving wood, stitching cloth, or illuminating manuscripts. To these workers, the tax felt unfairly weighted, pressing hardest on those whose livelihoods depended most upon flame. Some forms of resistance were more symbolic than practical. Stories circulated of households who deliberately chose to sit in darkness rather than feed the city's coffers. Whether such tales were exaggerated or not, they reveal a truth about perception. The candle tax was remembered not just as an economic burden, but as an intrusion into private life. To decide when to light a room had always been a household matter. Now, it seemed, even this most intimate decision carried the handprint of bureaucracy. Enforcement sometimes went further than sales. In certain periods, Parisian officials attempted to regulate production directly, taxing not the finished candle, but the raw material. This meant levies on tallow and wax before they were ever shaped into wicks and molds. Such measures were designed to capture revenue before it slipped through the cracks of informal markets, but they also spread the burden more widely, reaching into slaughterhouses, beekeepers, hives, and trading stalls. The tax, in this form, became a web that touched many corners of the city's economy. Comparisons were often drawn to other odd and unpopular taxes of the time. Across Europe, rulers had devised similar levies on windows, on salt, on hearths, and on chimneys. In England, the infamous window tax made householders choose between light and expense, sometimes leading them to brick up their windows to avoid fees. In France, the gabella tax on salt became so hated that it played a role in fueling revolutionary anger centuries later. Against this backdrop, the candle tax in Paris was not unique, but it was peculiarly symbolic. For light itself, like salt or air, seemed too basic, too essential, to be made into a taxable commodity. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. Priests burned candles in cathedrals, nobles filled their halls with them, and yet the poorest families were the ones who felt the weight of the levy most sharply. A wealthy household might hardly notice the tax, but for those living at the edge of subsistence, each coin spent on a candle was one not spent on bread. Thus the tax deepened the small inequities of daily life, reinforcing the gap between rich and poor in a city already marked by contrasts. Perhaps the strangest element of the whole affair was the question of measurement. How does one count a flame? A loaf of bread can be weighed, a jug of wine can be measured, but a candle transforms as it is used, melting slowly into nothing. The city's solution was to fix its attention not on the flame, but on the unit of purchase, the stick of tallow, the rod of wax. In the ledger, the candle was frozen in time, permanent and unchanging, even though in reality it was destined to vanish in smoke. There is something faintly poetic about this. A government trying to bind a flickering, vanishing thing into the solidity of ink and parchment. By the 15th century, the candle tax was deeply ingrained in Parisian life. It was not a temporary experiment, but a fixture of the city's finances. People complained, people evaded, but still they paid. In this way, the tax achieved what officials desired most, predictability. And yet, even as it endured, it shaped the culture of the city in subtle ways. It influenced when people chose to work, how long families lingered over their evening meals, and how much light was allotted to prayer, reading, or conversation. It reminded Parisians, in small but persistent ways, that their nights were not entirely their own. The records tell us little of the emotions this stirred, but one can imagine the quiet resentments it fostered. Each time a candle was lit, it was not only a small victory against the darkness, but also a reminder of the city's watchful eye. To burn a flame was, in a sense, to acknowledge the reach of authority. And perhaps this is why, centuries later, the candle tax remains one of those peculiar historical details that still captures attention. It is at once mundane and profound, a story of bureaucracy entangled with the primal need for light. Taxes often end as quietly as they begin. The candle tax, once a reliable stream of revenue for the city of Paris, eventually faded, not because people stopped needing light, but because new forms of administration, shifting priorities, and different ways of raising money made it less practical. Yet, even as the levy declined, its presence lingered in memory. To those who lived under it, the candle tax was not simply about money, but about the experience of living with a city's hand resting gently, and sometimes heavily, on the most ordinary part of life. The decline of the candle tax was gradual, tied in part to the broader transformation of urban finance. By the late Middle Ages, Paris had grown more complex. The city required not only lighting, but also paving, sanitation, defense, and poor relief. To manage these expanding needs, rulers and councils increasingly favored larger, more centralized systems of taxation, levying fees on entire trades, or demanding contributions from districts as collective units. Against this backdrop, the candle tax, with its endless record-keeping and susceptibility to evasion, began to feel outdated. At the same time, new forms of illumination slowly entered the urban world. Oil lamps, though never as widely used as candles in medieval Paris, began to appear in certain contexts, especially in wealthier homes and churches. In the centuries that followed, advances in glassmaking and improvements in lamp design would further expand these options. By the 17th century, organized street lighting in Paris, with lanterns placed along major roads, shifted the burden of light from the individual household to the public sphere. This made the idea of taxing private candles feel less essential, for the city itself was beginning to take responsibility for its nocturnal landscape. Still, for as long as the tax remained in place, it shaped behavior. Families carefully rationed their flames, deciding which rooms deserved the expense of light and which could be left in shadow. In poorer households, the decision often came down to a single candle placed on a table, around which every task of the evening, meals, mending, prayer, and conversation, had to be gathered. This simple practice created a rhythm of intimacy, drawing people close not only out of affection, but also out of necessity. One can imagine how such moments impressed themselves into memory, the candle flame becoming the quiet center of domestic life. In churches where candles held deep spiritual meaning, the tax raised subtle tensions. The symbolism of light in Christian ritual was profound, representing purity, hope, and the presence of the divine. To lay a coin at the altar for the lighting of a candle was both an offering and a prayer. Yet, when candles themselves carried an extra levy, questions arose: was this act of devotion being mediated not only by faith, but by bureaucracy? Clergy, of course, had means of acquiring candles in bulk, often exempt from certain taxes. But the association between sacred flame and civic revenue was an uncomfortable reminder of the blurred lines between the spiritual and the worldly. The eventual disappearance of the candle tax did not erase its imprint. It left behind the habit of careful calculation, the sense that light was a commodity as well as a comfort. For centuries afterward, even as lamps and eventually gaslight transformed Parisian nights, the memory of counting candles and coins lingered in cultural memory. In some ways, this memory anticipated the modern world, where utilities such as electricity and heat are metered, measured, and paid for month by month. The candle tax, primitive though it was a precursor to this reality, the recognition that even light could be priced. The story of the candle tax also reflects something broader about medieval life, the struggle of cities to balance order and liberty. Paris was not unique in taxing essentials, but it is striking how something so simple as a candle could become a symbol of that balance. On the one hand, the tax was a practical necessity, a way to fund services that benefited all. On the other hand, it was felt as an intrusion, a reminder that no sphere of life was beyond the reach of oversight. The flame that flickered in a humble room was, in a sense, shared with the city itself. By the 18th century, Paris would undergo dramatic changes in its relationship to light. The city became famous for its illuminated boulevards, its reputation as the city of light, tied to Enlightenment ideals as much as to physical brilliance. Public lanterns glowed over the Seine, and the darkness that had once defined medieval nights began to retreat. In this new age, the notion of taxing a single household candle seemed quaint, even archaic. Yet perhaps it was precisely because of those earlier struggles that the symbolism of illumination grew so powerful. To cast off shadows was not only a technological feat, but also a cultural one, a statement that light belonged to everyone, not merely those who could afford a taxed candle at their table. Looking back, the candle tax can seem like a minor footnote in the long history of Paris. It was neither as notorious as the salt gabelle, nor as visible as the window tax in England. But in its quiet way, it captured something essential about the human condition. To light a flame against the darkness is one of the most ancient gestures shared across cultures and centuries. That even this simple act could become entangled with laws, ledgers, and complaints tells us much about the nature of life in a great medieval city. And so the story of the candle tax is less about numbers than about atmosphere. It is about the way bureaucracy enters the home, about the shadow that lingers at the edge of the flame, about the awareness that even light carries a price. In the end, Parisians continued to live, to work, and to pray by candlelight, even as they muttered against the levee. The city glowed with countless small flames, each one both a comfort and a reminder of obligation. It is a scene at once ordinary and profound, a city in shadows, measured not only by its architecture and its politics, but by the tiny circles of light around which its people gathered each night. If you lived in Paris or any provincial town of medieval France, bread would have been the quiet center of your life. Each day's rhythm was shaped not by clocks or machines, but by the baking of loaves. From dawn until dusk, bread marked the measure of survival. It was more than food. It was a social contract between rulers and the ruled, between bakers and the people they served, and between households and the fragile supply of grain. To speak of bread in the Middle Ages is to speak of existence itself. In an age when diets were overwhelmingly shaped by necessity rather than choice, the majority of calories consumed by ordinary men and women came in the form of bread. For peasants in the countryside, this might be a coarse loaf, heavy with rye, barley, or whatever grain was locally available. For townsfolk, especially those in Paris, the bread was often made from wheat lighter, more digestible, but also more expensive. It is telling that medieval records did not always measure wages in coin, but in the price of bread that those coins could buy. Bread was the yardstick of life's stability. Imagine walking through Paris in the 14th century. The streets are narrow, the houses tall and leaning inward, casting shadows even at noon. Among the smells of tallow, smoke, and sewage, there is one aroma that cuts through everything else, the sharp, toasty fragrance of baking bread. The baker's oven was not simply a private affair. In many towns, ovens were communal or strictly regulated, often owned by the lord or by the municipality, with fees paid to use them. The very act of heating an oven was political, because bread had to be controlled to maintain social order. Bakers themselves formed a distinct class of tradespeople. In Paris, they belonged to guilds that outlined their responsibilities and set standards. These guilds did not exist to protect the consumer alone. They also defended the interests of bakers against unfair demands from rulers. Yet, the relationship was delicate. A baker was both a craftsman and a public servant, entrusted with a commodity too essential to leave to market whims. The weight of a loaf, its quality, and its price were matters watched closely, not only by city officials, but by neighbors and customers, ready to protest if they felt cheated. Bread was divided into kinds, depending on who you were. At the top of the social scale stood the fine white bread, made of the cleanest sifted wheat flour. It was soft, pale, and considered fitting for the tables of nobility, clergy, and wealthy merchants. Slightly below was brown bread, a darker loaf made from less finely milled wheat or with some rye mixed in. This was the standard bread of many urban dwellers, substantial and filling. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the heavy, black loaves of rye or barley, dense and sometimes sour, eaten by peasants and the poor. This hierarchy of bread mirrored the hierarchy of society itself. Religious symbolism deepened bread's importance. The Eucharist transformed a simple wafer into the body of Christ, reminding every parishioner that bread was sacred as well as practical. To break bread together was not simply to share a meal, but to acknowledge bonds of kinship and trust. When famine struck and bread became scarce, the hunger carried with it an almost spiritual anguish. People did not merely lack calories, they felt abandoned, cut off from the very substance of life. Because bread carried such weight, authorities sought to regulate it with remarkable precision. By the 13th century, Paris had what was known as the assize of bread, a regulation system that adjusted the size and weight of loaves in proportion to the price of grain. Instead of raising prices endlessly, bakers were required to bake smaller loaves when grain became expensive, and larger ones when it was plentiful. This meant that the poor might receive less bread in times of scarcity, but at least the coin they managed to scrape together could still purchase something. The alternative, letting bakers charge whatever they wished, was considered too dangerous. The control was not only economic, but also moral. To sell short-weight bread was considered a serious offense. In some towns, bakers who cheated their customers were punished by being paraded through the streets with false loaves hung around their necks, or even forced into the pillory. These public shaming rituals remind us that bread was not just food, but justice itself, a daily proof that rulers cared about fairness, or failed at it. For the ordinary Parisian, bread was the first concern in the morning. Families calculated carefully how much they could afford each day. It was common for workers to be paid partly in bread, or to have their wages judged against the bread standard. If bread prices rose sharply, workers might demand higher pay or else riot. More than once, unrest in Paris began with a cry not for abstract liberty, but for bread. Centuries later, in the French Revolution, women marched to Versailles under the same cry, du pain. The pattern was already well established in the medieval period, yet in times of plenty, bread was almost invisible, so ordinary that it was hardly remarked upon. It sat on every table, broken into pieces, dipped into broth or eaten with cheese. Richer households used bread as trencher-thick slices that served as edible plates on which meat and sauce were placed. Afterward, these bread trenchers were eaten, given to servants, or handed to beggars. In this way, bread connected every level of society, passing from the hands of the wealthy to the mouths of the poor. The city itself bore the imprint of bread. Millers, on the same ground, the wheat. Bakers, in narrow workshops, kneaded and baked it. Bread sellers hawked loaves in markets and at street corners. Regulations required that bread be sold in certain places, and inspectors occasionally checked weights and prices. Behind this system was the fragile reliance on grain supplies from the countryside. If harvests failed or weather turned harsh, the flow of grain to the city slowed, and suddenly every loaf seemed dearer. In this sense, bread was always on the edge of becoming political. A loaf was never just a loaf. It was a promise that authorities could maintain order and provision. When that promise failed, the people's trust collapsed with it. What seems to us a humble daily food was, to the medieval citizen, an indicator of the very health of their world. Still, one might ask, how did a substance so ordinary become a matter of such watchful control? Why did rulers spend such effort recording the price of bread, fixing weights, punishing bakers, and responding to shortages when they often ignored other hardships of the poor? The answer lies in bread's dual identity, both the humblest food and the one most necessary. To run out of bread was to face hunger and instability at once. Kings could risk losing battles, but they could not risk losing bread in the capital. As you imagine a medieval family breaking their daily loaf, you might wonder, how fragile was this system truly? Could a single bad harvest, a storm along the grain routes, or the greed of a few merchants plunge an entire city into unrest? And if bread was so carefully guarded, why did shortages still come so often? Bread was so central to medieval life that its regulation became one of the earliest and most elaborate forms of consumer protection. In Paris, as in other towns of France, the authorities recognized that bread could not be left to the free market alone. It was too dangerous, too necessary, too intimately tied to survival. So, rules were established, rules that governed every step from the grinding of grain to the weight of a finished loaf. Yet rules alone were never enough. Behind them loomed the ever-present threat of riots. For bread was the one commodity for which the people were willing to take to the streets. The regulations themselves were precise. Parisian authorities employed inspectors, often linked to the Guild of Bakers, to measure and weigh loaves. A system known as the assize of bread adjusted the required weight of a loaf according to the price of wheat. If grain was cheap, the loaves had to be larger. If grain was expensive, they could shrink. What remained constant was the coin paid by the consumer. This meant that the poorest might eat less in hard years, but they could still buy bread at a familiar price. For rulers, it was a way of preventing sudden shocks to the fragile urban economy. The rules extended beyond size and price. Bakers were forbidden to mix inferior grains into bread that was supposed to be pure wheat. They were expected to knead thoroughly, bake properly, and sell honestly. In many towns, bakers were required to stamp their loaves with identifying marks, so that if a bad loaf was discovered, the culprit could be traced. Punishments for dishonesty were severe. A baker caught selling underweight bread could be fined, flogged, or made to endure public humiliation. One common punishment was to strap the fraudulent baker to a cart and drag him through the streets while crowds jeered. In extreme cases, bakers might even be banished from the city. Why such harsh treatment for what seems a small crime? Because to shortchange a customer on bread was not seen as mere cheating. It was treason against the community's survival. If one baker was allowed to sell dishonest loaves, trust in the entire bread supply could collapse. Anger against a single baker could quickly spill into anger against the authorities who failed to stop him. The bakers themselves did not always accept these regulations meekly. Belonging to a guild meant both privilege and burden. The guild defended its members' rights against outsiders and provided a degree of solidarity. But it also enforced discipline, sometimes harshly. Bakers were required to open their ovens at specified times, to maintain fair practices, and to submit to inspections. For those who tried to cut corners, the guild could be as unforgiving as the city officials. Yet, at the same time, bakers felt the constant pressure of serving two masters, the hungry public and the watchful authorities. The tension was most visible when grain prices spiked. A poor harvest in the countryside could send wheat prices soaring. Merchants transporting grain along rivers or roads might hoard supplies, hoping to profit from scarcity. Rumors would spread quickly in the city there was grain, but it was being hidden, or diverted, or sold elsewhere. The sight of smaller loaves at the same price fanned resentment. To a hungry worker, it looked like manipulation, not regulation. Riots were often the result. In Paris, records describe episodes in which crowds gathered outside bakeries, demanding larger loaves or lower prices. Sometimes they seized bread carts in the markets, distributing the loaves themselves. Women, who were usually responsible for buying bread for their households, were often at the forefront of these protests. Their voices carried particular weight, for their hunger was seen as the hunger of families and children. A bread riot was rarely just about bread. It was an accusation that the authorities had failed in their most basic duty to keep the people alive. One famous episode occurred in the early 14th century, during a period of bad harvests and high prices. Crowds stormed bakeries in Paris, accusing bakers of hoarding and fraud. Officials tried to restore order by punishing a few bakers publicly, but the unrest showed how fragile the system was. Another outbreak came later in the century, when rumors spread that bakers were mixing sawdust into bread to make it go further. Whether true or not, the rumor sparked violence, for the idea of corrupt bread was unbearable. The pattern repeated across France. In Rouen, Dijon, and smaller towns, grain shortages often led to riots at the bakeries or the markets. Sometimes, the riots were brief, dissolving once officials promised action. At other times, they turned deadly. Authorities feared such riots, not only for the destruction they caused, but for the precedent they set. If people could seize bread by force, what else might they demand? For this reason, rulers took extraordinary steps to secure grain supplies. Kings and city councils alike tried to maintain reserves of grain stored in granaries against times of shortage. They attempted to regulate trade routes, ensuring that grain shipments reached Paris rather than being sold off elsewhere. At times, rulers even ordered that grain be seized from merchants and distributed at controlled prices. All of this was done to prevent the spark of hunger from igniting into the fire of rebellion. But still, rules could only go so far. The medieval economy was fragile, dependent on weather, harvests, and transportation that was often slow or dangerous. A single storm could sink a grain barge on the Seine, sending prices upward. A harsh winter could freeze the rivers and halt shipments. In such conditions, even the best regulations could not supply enough bread. Riots were not merely the product of anger. They were the desperate cry of people at the edge of survival. And yet, despite the unrest, the system endured. For centuries, bread remained the carefully regulated heart of urban life. Bakers continued to knead their dough, inspectors continued to weigh loaves, and the people continued to watch with suspicion. The rules kept the city from collapse more often than not, but everyone knew that beneath the surface calm, the possibility of riot was never far away. This precarious balance raises a question. If bread was so carefully managed, why was it always the focus of popular anger rather than, say, meat, wine, or vegetables? The answer lies in bread's unique role. It was not a luxury, but a necessity. To go without meat was unpleasant. To go without bread was unthinkable. That unshakable reliance gave the people both their vulnerability and their strength. They could be crushed by shortages, but they could also rally around bread as a rallying cry, knowing that everyone understood its urgency. Thus, bread, though humble, became the measure of justice in medieval France. Every loaf sold was a small contract between baker, ruler, and citizen. Every violation of that contract risked violence, and every riot over bread reminded rulers that their power was, quite literally, bound up with the daily loaf. If bread was the foundation of daily life, it was also the foundation of politics. In medieval France, rulers quickly learned that their authority was measured not only in armies, laws, or coins, but in loaves of bread. To govern a hungry people was to court disaster. To keep them fed was to earn loyalty, or at least to keep rebellion at bay. Bread was more than food. It was a symbol of order, justice, and the promise of survival. Kings and city councils both understood this truth. In Paris, the regulation of bread prices was overseen not only by guilds and inspectors, but by officials directly appointed by the crown. The Privat des Marchands, the city's leading officer, carried the responsibility of ensuring that bread was fairly priced and sufficiently supplied. A loaf of bread, humble though it seemed, was as much a political object as a royal seal or a coat of arms. When people looked at their daily loaf, they saw not just nourishment, but the reach of authority into their lives. This connection gave bread a peculiar double nature. On one hand, it was the food of the poor, eaten in vast quantities by workers, peasants, and servants. On the other, it was a constant reminder of the ruling powers, who regulated its price and punished its fraud. The baker, standing at his oven, was both craftsman and public servant, bound by rules that came from above. When bread was plentiful and cheap, the people might grumble about other hardships but accept their lot. When it grew scarce or small, suspicion turned instantly to rulers. Were they doing enough? Were they hiding stores? Were they siding with merchants against the people? Bread also held deep religious meaning. In the language of Christianity, bread was sacred, the body of Christ in the Eucharist. The daily bread prayed for in the Lord's Prayer, the metaphor for God's care. To break bread was to live in communion. To be without bread was to feel forsaken. This spiritual weight deepened the political one. A shortage of bread could be read not only as economic misfortune, but as divine punishment, or as evidence that rulers had failed in their God-given duty to protect the people. Priests reminded their flocks that bread was the gift of heaven, but also that justice demanded rulers ensure its fair distribution. Sermons, chronicles, and proverbs reveal how often bread served as shorthand for life itself. A person might say to have bread and water when speaking of survival. To describe someone as without bread was to say they were destitute. Proverbs taught that a man without bread is not a man, underscoring the idea that bread was the very condition of humanity. In this light, political disputes about bread were never only about price or weight. They touched the very definition of community, dignity, and order. It is no surprise, then, that when unrest rose in medieval towns, it often took the form of demands for bread. A crowd might shout not for abstract reforms, but simply for loaves. Sometimes officials, facing such protests, ordered bread to be distributed freely from city stores, hoping to pacify the people. On other occasions, rulers staged symbolic acts, riding through the city to show grain wagons arriving, or personally overseeing the sale of bread at controlled prices. These gestures were political theater, meant to reassure the people that their rulers were attentive and just, yet the balance was delicate. A king who failed to secure bread risked more than murmurs. He risked revolt. French monarchs were haunted by the knowledge that hungry subjects could turn against them. This fear grew sharper in the later Middle Ages, as towns swelled with people and grain supplies became harder to guarantee. Chronicles note the anxiety that swept through royal courts during bad harvests. Would the granaries hold out? Would shipments arrive in time? Would the people remain calm? Bread thus became a mirror of power. When it was present, rulers could point to it as proof of their care. When it was absent, they were judged harshly, no matter the circumstances. The people did not care about weather, floods, or lost shipments. They cared only that their daily bread was on the table. A hungry stomach made little distinction between natural disaster and political neglect. The legacy of these medieval struggles extended far beyond the Middle Ages. By the 16th and 17th centuries, as France grew more populous and markets more complex, bread remained at the center of political life. The bread riots that erupted in provincial towns were echoes of medieval patterns, with crowds demanding justice in the simplest of forms: larger loaves, fairer prices, honest bakers. And by the 18th century, these patterns converged in the most famous upheaval of all, the French Revolution, when revolutionaries shouted for liberty, equality, and fraternity. They also shouted for bread. The March of Parisian Women to Versailles in October 1789, perhaps the most dramatic protest of the early revolution, began not with slogans about constitutions, but with the cry for bread. They stormed the royal palace because their families were hungry, and they believed the king held the key to the grain supply. The symbolism was clear. A ruler who could not guarantee bread had lost the right to rule. In this way, bread connected medieval Paris to revolutionary France. Across centuries, the political contract between ruler and ruled was measured not only in law and loyalty, but in the weight of loaves. Bread was the currency of survival, and its scarcity was the spark of rebellion. To speak of bread was to speak of justice, authority, and power itself. And so, the humble loaf carries with it the story of governance. To study its price and its rules is to glimpse the heartbeat of medieval society. The bakers kneading dough in their dim ovens, the officials weighing loaves at the market stalls, the crowds gathering to protest shortages, all were participants in a drama that went far beyond food. Bread was life. Bread was order. Bread was power. When you imagine the landscape of medieval Europe, it is not the spires of churches or the battlements of castles that first determined the rhythm of ordinary life, but the rivers. Rivers cut through towns. They defined borders. They carried goods, and they obstructed journeys. For much of the Middle Ages, a wide river without a bridge was not just a natural feature. It was an obstacle that could mean the difference between prosperity and isolation. To cross without a bridge meant relying on ferrymen who charged their own small fees, or braving the currents with carts, livestock, and wares. The simple wooden or stone bridge, which you may take for granted today, was in medieval times one of the most valued pieces of civic infrastructure, so valued, in fact, that its existence was tied closely to both wealth and power. In many towns, bridges were the very arteries of commerce. A market might thrive on one side of a river only. If there was a crossing to bring peasants and traders from the far bank, merchants moving from one region to another depended on a sequence of bridges along a route, and without them, caravans could be delayed for days. If you picture yourself as a wool merchant in 14th century France, leading a cart with bolts of fabric toward Paris, the crossing of rivers would mark your journey more than the villages you passed. Without bridges, the flow of goods stopped, and with it, the flow of money. It is for this reason that medieval rulers, bishops, and wealthy patrons often invested in bridge building, not merely as a matter of convenience, but as a display of authority. A bridge declared, "Here is order, here is safety, here is civilization maintained through stone and labor." The earliest bridges of medieval Europe were often humble structures, timber, laid across pilings with planks that needed regular replacement. Floods could wash them away, ice could crack them, and armies on the march might burn them down to slow an enemy. To build in stone was far more expensive, requiring skilled masons and often years of labor, but the reward was durability. Towns that could boast a stone bridge gained a mark of prestige. The Pont Saint-Benazet in Avignon, begun in the 12th century, is one of the most famous examples, and though only fragments survive today, it once stood as a marvel of its age. Bridges such as this were celebrated in chronicles, for they seemed almost miraculous in their endurance. Yet endurance came at a cost. Stone bridges demanded not only funds to build, but constant money to maintain. The currents of rivers undermined piers, weeds and mud clogged arches, and the pounding of hooves and wheels wore down the roadway. Medieval engineers had no illusions. A bridge was never finished. It was always in the process of needing attention. And so the question arose, who would pay? Towns rarely had the treasury to fund these projects indefinitely. Rulers, whether kings or lords, might provide initial patronage but expected revenues in return. The church sometimes supported bridge construction as a form of pious work, for aiding travelers was seen as a Christian duty, but even then, money had to flow steadily to keep the structure sound. The answer, time and again, was tolls. If you wanted to cross, you would contribute to the upkeep. It was a simple idea, but it carried enormous implications. For peasants bringing sacks of grain, a toll meant a smaller profit. For pilgrims trudging toward a shrine, it meant stretching their coins thinner. For traders, it meant one more fee among dozens, as every lord along the road sought his share. To walk across a medieval bridge was to feel the invisible weight of a system that balanced necessity against cost. Consider the bridge at Pont de l'Arc in Normandy, built in the 14th century. It was strategically placed on the Seine, and it became not only a passageway but a checkpoint. Merchants dreaded it, for they knew that to cross meant not only the toll, but also the scrutiny of officials who might seize goods or impose additional fees. Yet there was no alternative, no nearby ford, no rival bridge. To avoid it was to lengthen a journey by days or even weeks. Bridges, like Pont de l'Arc, remind you that in medieval Europe, infrastructure was power, and tolls were a form of taxation that touched nearly every traveler. But before delving into the bureaucracy of toll collection and the endless complaints it generated, you must pause to understand the sheer importance of the bridge itself. In a world without paved highways, where winter rains turned dirt paths into mud, the crossing of a river was often the most reliable marker of progress. Bridges became meeting places, markets, and even symbols of identity. Some towns, quite literally, took their names from the bridge at their heart: Cambridge, Oxford, a ford for oxen, and countless ponts in France. They were not only lifelines for trade, but anchors of communities. You might imagine that the people of the Middle Ages simply accepted the presence of tolls with resignation, seeing them as part of life. But there were deeper tensions. Behind the toll booths lay questions about fairness, justice, and the right of rulers to tax what seemed like the natural course of the world, the act of crossing from one bank to another. In this sense, bridges were more than lifelines. They were also points of control, where authority could be exercised in its most direct form: pay or do not cross. And so, before exploring the world of the toll collectors, the booths, and the ledgers in which every sheep and cart was recorded, it is worth asking, how did people react when something as vital as a bridge was turned into a gateway of profit? If the bridge itself was the lifeline, then the toll collector was its gatekeeper. At the far end of many medieval bridges, you would have found a small booth, a wooden hut, or sometimes just a covered table, where an official sat with his ledger. His task was deceptively simple: to note who passed, what they carried, and to ensure the correct payment was made. Yet this job placed him at the intersection of commerce, law, and daily frustration. Few roles in medieval society inspired as much suspicion or irritation as that of the toll collector, for his presence turned every crossing into a moment of negotiation. Tolls came in bewildering variety. Some were charged per person. A farmer on foot might pay only a few coins, while a merchant with a horse-drawn cart faced a heavier fee. Livestock brought its own schedule of charges: so much for each cow, less for each sheep, a token sum for a flock of geese. Goods were taxed not merely by volume, but by type. Wine might incur one rate, grain another, cloth yet another. Foreign merchants often paid more than local ones, for tolls doubled as a way to favor local trade. It is easy to imagine the collector patiently asking questions, inspecting sacks, lifting lids on barrels, and scribbling down figures, while a line of weary travelers grumbled behind. The system depended on paperwork, or at least on record-keeping. Suited to the age, in busier crossings, tolls were not left to memory. Ledger, some of which still survive in archives, list the endless stream of goods: 2 carts of rye, 10 sheep, a merchant of Flanders with 4 bolts of linen. These records were used both to prevent fraud and to ensure that lords or city councils received their due share of revenue. For tolls were not merely maintenance fees, they were rents, profits, and sometimes outright monopolies farmed out to private collectors who bid for the right to operate a booth. The man sitting at the bridge might not even be a town official. He might be a lessee who had paid a lump sum to the local lord, confident that he could make a tidy profit by squeezing every traveler. This arrangement bred resentment. Chroniclers and letter writers across medieval Europe complain of tolls as excessive, arbitrary, or corrupt. Merchants accused collectors of inventing new charges, of weighing goods unfairly, or of pocketing coins without issuing receipts. Rumors abounded that collectors colluded with local markets, delaying outsiders with red tape while allowing favored traders to pass swiftly. In towns that depended heavily on commerce, these accusations sometimes led to riots, with booths torn down and collectors driven away. Even when corruption was absent, the process was slow. Imagine a caravan of pack animals arriving at a bridge. Each donkey or mule had to be counted, each sack tallied. The collector might insist on inspecting the goods himself, poking through bags of flour or untying bundles of cloth. Travelers cursed the delay, for the day's journey was already long enough without standing in line at a toll booth. The collector, for his part, faced equal frustration. He had to deal with travelers who hid goods, lied about quantities, or tried to rush past without paying. He had to balance firmness with caution, for a wronged merchant could carry complaints to the lord or bishop who oversaw the crossing. Resistance took many forms. Some merchants chose longer, more difficult routes to avoid notorious toll stations. Others bribed collectors, slipping them coins to look the other way. In extreme cases, violence broke out. Toll booths were burned, collectors beaten, and revenues lost until order was restored. Such incidents alarmed rulers, for toll income was not trivial. In a prosperous trading town, the bridge toll could rival the revenues from markets or gates. To lose that income was to weaken the financial base of both civic and noble authority. The toll collector, then, was both necessary and despised. He embodied the paradox of medieval infrastructure. The bridge was a gift to the people, a symbol of shared prosperity, yet its use was constantly rationed and monetized. Travelers muttered under their breath, but they paid, because the bridge was indispensable. To ford the river elsewhere risked loss of goods, drowning of animals, or days of delay. The booth, the ledger, the coin, these were as fixed a part of the landscape as the stone arches rising above the water. From the perspective of authority, tolls were justified as fair. The argument was straightforward. The bridge cost money to build. It cost money to repair. And therefore it was only right that those who benefited from it should contribute. Yet fairness is a slippery concept. When tolls were raised during a poor harvest, or when merchants felt that they were taxed twice for the same cartload once at a gate, again at the bridge, resentment grew into protest. To pay tolls was to acknowledge the Lord's control over the landscape, and that acknowledgement was often given grudgingly. What toll collectors may not have realized, as they scribbled entries in their ledgers, was how deeply these small transactions shaped the experience of travel itself. Every bridge crossing was a reminder that the road was not free, that movement was never simple, and that authority could reach into the most basic act of going from one bank to the other. And in this way, toll collectors unwittingly transformed bridges from lifelines into symbols of control. By the later Middle Ages, the bridge toll was no longer seen as a temporary measure to fund construction or repair. It had become a permanent fixture of life, a part of the rhythm of travel. For merchants and common travelers alike, the act of crossing a bridge was tied to the clink of coins, the exchange of words with the toll collector, and the mental calculation of whether the journey would still be profitable once fees were paid. To travel was to budget not only for food, lodging, and fodder for animals, but also for the inevitable tolls that dotted the road ahead. Records from French, German, and Italian towns reveal the scale of these charges. A merchant moving a large cart of grain might pay tolls at 3 different bridges before reaching a city, each one cutting into his margin. For long-distance traders who carried goods from Flanders to Italy or from the Rhineland to the Baltic, tolls were not incidental. They could make or break a venture. Complaints poured into city councils, guild halls, and princely courts. Petitions survive from merchants begging for exemptions or reductions, especially when multiple tolls piled up along a single river route. For the authorities, however, tolls were a prized source of income. City governments, lords, and bishops all relied on them to fund public works, maintain defenses, and even finance wars. In times of crisis, tolls could be doubled or extended, and while this angered travelers, rulers knew they could not simply avoid the bridges. In many ways, the toll booth represented an early form of taxation on mobility itself. Unlike land, taxes, or market fees, it was unavoidable. You wished to cross, you paid, and yet, despite the frustration they caused, tolls also shaped the geography of medieval Europe in lasting ways. Some towns thrived precisely because they controlled bridge crossings. Others languished when tolls were set too high, discouraging merchants from passing through. The balance was delicate. Set the fee too low, and revenues suffered. Set it too high, and trade slipped away to rival towns with cheaper or untolled bridges. Thus, toll policy became a matter of economic strategy, debated in council chambers and lordly courts with as much care as treaties or taxes. For ordinary people, however, these debates were invisible. What they felt was the weight of the coin in their hand, the irritation of stopping yet again, and the constant sense that movement itself was being measured, valued, and restricted. A peasant leading a cow across a bridge might mutter at the collector, but he would pay, because the alternative wading into a swift current, risking animal and livelihood, was worse. To live in a world of tolls was to accept that nature's obstacles had been replaced by man's. Over time, resentment gave rise to efforts at reform. Some guilds negotiated collective exemptions, paying lump sums to cover their members for an entire year. Certain rulers abolished tolls on popular routes, hoping to attract commerce and goodwill. A few religious orders even built bridges specifically to be toll-free, presenting them as acts of charity to weary travelers. These rare free crossings were celebrated in songs and stories, remembered as symbols of generosity in an otherwise taxing landscape. But most bridges remained firmly bound to their tolls, their collectors watching, their ledgers filling with ink. The deeper irony is that tolls, while resented, were also necessary. Without them, bridges would not have been built at all. The stones had to be cut, the arches maintained, the roads leading to them kept passable. In a sense, every toll coin was a quiet contribution to a shared resource. Travelers cursed, but they also depended on the very thing they paid for. The bridge toll was thus both burden and blessing, a source of complaint, yet a foundation of mobility. As Europe moved into the early modern age and governments became stronger, some tolls were consolidated or abolished. National monarchies realized that freer movement of goods enriched the whole realm, and new forms of taxation replaced the patchwork of local fees. But in the medieval centuries, when power was fractured and every lord or town sought its due, the toll was king. It slowed trade, shaped towns, and defined travel as much as the bridges themselves. When you imagine a merchant journeying across medieval Europe, you should not picture only the open road or the busy market at the destination. You must also picture the long wait at the bridge, the grumble of oxen as they stood in line, the clatter of coins exchanged, and the toll collector leaning over his ledger. For, in that moment, the traveler was reminded that nothing in life was free, not the bridge, not the river crossing, not even the simple act of moving forward. And so, the story of bridges in the Middle Ages is not only about the marvels of engineering or the endurance of stone arches. It is also about the economics of control, the quiet but relentless tolling of coins, and the realization that every crossing carried a price.